Welcome back to part 3. Keystone species are species that have a large effect on their environment even though they're generally present in small numbers. We're going to look at examples to help you understand what that means. Oftentimes, they're ecosystem engineers. So this elephant, for example, this beautiful bull named Valley, beautiful tusks. Elephants come by and they eat a lot of the plants. Like I talked about before in the last video, they eat everything's fruit. They leave mostly spiny, thorny portions of plants. So they change the relative abundance of plants. They also create pathways through the bush. So like tortoises that couldn't otherwise get through can get through and eat more out of inner areas of the bush. They provide dung that has lots of uses for like dung beetles. They also are generally the guarders of the water areas. So water is usually a limiting resource, and elephants guard it. They're dominant at the water holes. They control who's getting water. So their presence or absence drastically changes the area. There were two areas where I was at, a north and a south. The north had elephants, the south did not. It looked completely different in the south. There were different plants, lots of prickly pears, much more vegetation, less dry areas, because the elephants weren't there. You'll often see it as predators. So like this jaguar predates upon lots of different species. They're a generalist, so they help keep lots of middle-level species populations under control. Beavers make dams. They change water flow, waterways. Sea stars are a keystone species. One researcher took sea stars out of an area, and what happened was the mussels, clam species that sea stars predate upon, overwhelmed all the other species and took them out. Sea otters. In the Pacific Northwest, there's like these kelp forests, and sea otters are there as well as sea urchins. Sea otters eat sea urchins to keep their populations low. If they weren't there, the kelp forest would be consumed by sea urchins. Another species is the prairie dog. They're also considered umbrella species because other species rely on them to survive. For example, this is the burrowing owl. It uses old prairie dog dens as its homes. If there were no prairie dog dens, they wouldn't have any homes. Black-footed ferrets eat prairie dogs, so as the prairie dog population in the U.S. has decreased, so has the black-footed ferret. Their numbers have dropped. They are endangered. However, they've been having really good conservation efforts occurring to bring that species back. Another thing you can look at in this environment are what are called indicator species. So there, if you look at these species, they often tell you when things are starting to go wrong. They're the first thing where it goes wrong. Amphibians are oftentimes indicator species. And what do you think is happening to amphibian species right now? Not great things. So they're indicating poor things to come. What happens when we disturb an area? Disturbances are anything that, at least temporarily, damages communities. They can destroy organisms or change resource availability. Examples, we looked at fires before, storms, flood, droughts, and people. These can all alter the ecosystem. This is an example of last year's U.S. seasonal drought outlook. You can see that there was a large drought that year in California, and that has continued, whereas the drought in this area this year is different. It's now flooded. Disturbances can cause good things or bad things. They can cause previously unknown diseases to occur. Fun fact, there are some viruses they found in the Arctic, in the ice, that are 20,000 years old. And as it thaws, those can be released, so that's another potential harm of climate change. But they can provide opportunities for other organisms to grow. So when this tree falls over from like a storm, it can provide habitat and housing for other organisms. looked at communities. Now let's look at the whole ecosystem more. So the ecosystem, remember, is those species, the communities, as well as the abiotic factors, the energy, soil, water. If you remember from the first chapter, we discussed that energy flows through the system. It's always put in by the sun and goes through, whereas chemicals cycle. You can have carbon go from the air into a tree, into an animal, into the ground, back into the air, for example. So energy we have to keep putting in, whereas if it's a closed system, the nutrients there will cycle. Energy straight line flows through. Chemicals circular, recycled. Energy flow is very important. All organisms need energy for growth, maintenance, reproduction, and in many species, locomotion or movement. So the amount of organic material in an ecosystem is the biomass. And the rate at which we convert the solar energy into the chemical energy as biomass is our primary production. So different ecosystems have different primary production levels, and it's not what you would necessarily guess to be the highest. The most productive, on average, are rainforests and coral reefs, where we're making the most biomass from that sun energy. Ecological pyramids, like food chains, show us the energy flow. So for example, this caterpillar is eating plant material, so it's taking in energy from the plant. And where does that energy go? Well, most of it is excreted as feces. 35% goes to cellular respiration to make energy and do normal cell work, and 15% is for growth. So out of 100 kilocalories it eats, only up to about 15 is for growth. That can be anywhere from 5% to 15. Usually you'll see about 10%. So this means that each level you go up the food chain, you're taking a lot of this energy and it's exiting the system. So let's look at that energy from level to level. So to support the next level up, you have this much corn. Those are the producers taking in the sun energy, converting it into chemical energy. Then the next level, you've got your primary consumers. And so vegetarians, any vegetables you eat, are the second level. So out of that corn, 10% of the energy or so is going into your growth. But when you go up another level, 10% goes into the cow's growth. So then out of every 100 grams you eat of meat, only 10% of that is going into your growth. So from the corn, you're only getting about 1% towards your growth. So as we eat more meat and go up more trophic levels, more food levels, we're getting less of that original sun energy, so it required more input. So that's why if you eat more vegetables, eat meat a couple times less, you're also decreasing the amount of corn you have to grow, for example. Chemical cycling is important for ecosystems as well. We'll look at how different nutrients move through systems. You've got plant matter, for example, taking the nutrients from the soil, getting eaten, going to animals, and then those dying and getting broken down by decomposers. But it's going to be a little bit different for each chemical. So these chemical cyclings are called biogeochemical cyclings. So that's how the nutrients move through the cycle. You've got what's called an abiotic reservoir, where you've got like nutrients outside living organisms, like in the soil or in the ocean, for example. So those are in our geologic soil, the abiotic reservoir. And then the nutrients go to producers. Producers either die and have it decomposed, or they get eaten by consumers, and consumers die and get decomposed and go back to that reservoir. They can either be local, like you're looking at the nitrogen levels in the forest by your house, or they can be global, looking at the whole world's nitrogen levels. So we'll look at carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Carbon, we talked about a lot, is the backbone for organic materials. Phosphorus and nitrogen are also important nutrients. So carbon cycles globally. It moves between the biotic and abiotic. Remember photosynthesis and cellular respiration? Those are going to be really important. So photosynthesis, we take carbon dioxide from the air, use light energy and water, and we make sugar. So we have plants taking in carbon dioxide. Remember, photosynthesis takes place in chloroplasts, those organelles in plants that have the ability to convert sun energy to sugar. And then once we've made those sugars, we use it through cellular respiration at the mitochondria to make ATP and release that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So summary, plants make energy through photosynthesis, respiration, mitochondria break it down, and plants have mitochondria too, to make energy. So here's the big picture. If you view it in the PowerPoint, some of these are animations where you've got carbon dioxide in the air, photosynthesis takes it in, gets eaten or decomposes. Consumers do cellular respiration, they release carbon dioxide, and then when they die, that goes into the soil, gets decomposed, gets absorbed by plants, or goes into the air after it's burned, and goes back around. There's the animation. Phosphorus. Phosphorus is an important component for plants and animals for like teeth and bones. In plants, phosphorus is important for photosynthesis. Phosphorus doesn't have an atmospheric component. There's no phosphorus gas, so it stays ground level. So you can see how phosphorus is somewhat similar. It can move through plants to animals to be decomposed and either go into waters and rocks or back into the plants. Nitrogen, also important for plants and animals. We use nitrogen for our muscle contractions. In plants, nitrogen is important for chlorophyll. It's a main part. That's the pigment that takes in the sun energy and makes energy. And nitrogen goes into the atmosphere and the soil. Those are two abiotic places that it's stored. You need nitrogen fixers to do nitrogen fixation. And what that does is that takes the gaseous nitrogen, that's the main component of our air that we're breathing, and they turn it into nitrogen that plants can assimilate or take in. So nitrogen is generally fixed by nitrogen fixing bacteria. So those take the nitrogen from the air and add it to an organic molecule so the plants can use it. And animation you can click, go through. So nitrogen can be in the atmosphere and the soil. Bacteria fix it. It comes into like the plant roots and the plant can absorb it. You can go into the plants here. Can also nitrogen fixing bacteria take it in. It can go into plants' roots. They can grow. They can have that then die, get decomposed, go back in. Animals can also eat the plants and get it that way. Nitrogen is a very important part of fertilizers, as is phosphorus. And that can have large effects on ecosystems. We're going to look at how when people fertilize their lawns and over-fertilize them, these chemicals harm aquatic water systems.